Hello everyone, my name is John Sierra and I am a Tolkien scholar. That means that I am always learning about and also teaching about Tolkien's works, whether it's The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, any of his works, or the man himself. And I am here to answer your questions. If you have any questions for me that you would like answered, there's a link in my description to my Quora account. You just hit a little button that says Ask. It's very, very easy to make an account on Quora. And you could just tag me. Even if you don't go through my account, if you just have a Quora account and you ask any Tolkien question, it's likely that it'll recommend people to tag. They call it an ask to answer, and I will definitely be on that list if it's anything related to Tolkien's works. So I am going to feature my, let's see how many this time. I believe we have something like 17 this time. 17 questions from the past week that have been submitted to me on Quora. And of course, you can always ask questions in the comments down below. That is always welcome. But if you want to be featured in a video, that's the way to do it. Anyway, as we normally do and have made a tradition out of, I would like to start this with a reading. And this week's reading is going to be from the Fellowship of the Ring, which is, of course, the first volume comprising of the first two books of The Lord of the Rings. And I'm going to read a bit of the Bridge of Khazad-dûm, which is where the scene where the Balrog comes and Gandalf faces off against it. Legolas turned and set an arrow to the string, though it was a long shot for his small bow. He drew, but his hand fell and the arrow slipped to the ground. He gave a cry of dismay and fear. Two great trolls appeared. They bore great slabs of stone and flung them down to serve as gangways over the fire. But it was not the trolls that had filled the elf with terror. The ranks of the orcs had opened, and they crowded away, as if they themselves were afraid. Something was coming up behind them. What it was could not be seen. It was like a great shadow, in the middle of which was a dark form, of man shape maybe, yet greater. And a power and terror seemed to be in it, and to go before it. It came to the edge of the fire, and the light faded as if a cloud had bent over it. Then with a rush it leaped across the fissure. The flames roared up to greet it and wreathed about it, and a black smoke swirled in the air. Its streaming mane kindled and blazed behind it. In its right hand was a blade like a stabbing tongue of fire. In its left it held a whip of many thongs. "Aye, aye," wailed Legolas. "A Balrog! A Balrog has come!" Gimli stared with wide eyes. "Durin's bane," he cried, and letting his axe fall, he covered his face. "A Balrog," muttered Gandalf. "Now I understand." He faltered and leaned heavily on his staff. "What an evil fortune, and I am already weary." The dark figure streaming with fire raced towards them. The orcs yelled and poured over the stone gangways. Then Boromir raised his horn and blew. Loud the challenge rang and followed, like the shout of many throats under the cavernous roof. For a moment the orcs quailed, and the fiery shadow halted. Then the echoes died as suddenly as a flame blown out by a dark wind, and the enemy advanced again. "Over the bridge!" cried Gandalf, recalling his strength. "Fly! This is a foe beyond any of you. I must hold the narrow way. Fly!" Aragorn and Boromir did not heed the command, but still held their ground side by side behind Gandalf at the far end of the bridge. The others halted just within the doorway at the hall's end and turned, unable to leave their leader to face the enemy alone. The Balrog reached the bridge. Gandalf stood in the middle of the span, leaning on his staff in his left hand, but in his other hand Glamdring gleamed cold and white. His enemy halted again, facing him, and the shadow about it reached out like two vast wings. It raised the whip, and the thongs whined and cracked. Fire came from its nostrils, but Gandalf stood firm. "You cannot pass," he said. The orcs stood still, and a dead silence fell. "I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, Flame of Adun. Go back to the shadow. You cannot pass." The Balrog made no answer. The fire in it seemed to die, but the darkness grew. It stepped forward slowly onto the bridge, and suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. But still Gandalf could be seen glimmering in the gloom. He seemed small and altogether alone, grey and bent, like a wizened tree before the onset of a storm. From out of the shadow a red sword leaped flaming. Glamdring glittered white in answer. There was a ringing clash and a stab of white fire. The Balrog fell back and its sword flew up in molten fragments. The wizard swayed on the bridge, stepped back a pace, and then again stood still. "You cannot pass," he said. With a bound, the Balrog leaped full upon the bridge. Its whip whirled and hissed. "He cannot stand alone," cried Aragorn suddenly, and ran back along the bridge. "Elendil," he shouted. "I am with you, Gandalf." "Gondor," cried Boromir, and leapt after him. At that moment, Gandalf lifted his staff, and crying aloud, he smote the bridge before him. The staff broke asunder and fell from his hand. A blinding sheet of white flame sprang up. The bridge cracked. Right at the Balrog's feet it broke, and the stone upon which it stood crashed into the gulf, while the rest remained poised, quivering like a tongue of rock thrust out into the emptiness. With a terrible cry, the Balrog fell forward, and its shadow plunged down and vanished. But even as it fell, it swung its whip, and the thongs lashed and curled about the wizard's knees, dragging him to the brink. He staggered and fell, grasped vainly at the stone, and slid into the abyss. "Fly, you fools!" he cried, and was gone. So that's, I tell you, I remember reading that for the first time as a young boy. I think I must have been about 11 or 12 years old when I first read The Fellowship of the Ring. I had, maybe even a little bit younger, but I think it was around that. I think it was around 11 or 12 years old, and I still remember, I had read The Hobbit, and I was very attached to the character of Gandalf, so to read that he had basically been killed off in the sequel, The Fellowship of the Ring, I was quite dismayed, and I felt every bit as sad as the Fellowship did when they came out of Moria. Of course, we know that he does return in The Two Towers as Gandalf the White, and now we know his true stature and his true nature as a Maiar spirit and everything. But back then, when I was a young boy, he was just this old wizard that I was fond of. So. There you have it. That's a little bit of the Fellowship of the Ring. Let's get to your questions. I do have quite a few to get through. We have 17 questions today. But I think we can get through it in I don't want to say a rapid pace, but a good clip I think we can do. All right. So this first question was asked by, I don't know if it's Dennis or Denis. I think it might be Denis Stroh. Denis Stroh. I hope I'm saying your name right. But this person asked, how did the Dead Marshes form? Was there some kind of magic involved? So the Dead Marshes are actually a perfectly normal, natural swampland. They weren't created by anybody in particular, other than you could say that the Ainur created all of Middle-earth and all the lands within, and that it is possible that during the War of Valar, that especially with it being near to Mordor, it's possible that it may have been Melkor that specifically created a marsh there, but it's just really a swamp. It's a swamp which is a collection of pools and muck. It's very close to the Emyn Muil, which is near Dagorlad. Now the Battle of Dagorlad happened there, nearby to the marshes, and the slain elves and men were buried there in an area that was close to the Dead Marshes, but the marshland actually expanded, and so as the Dead Marshes grew bigger, it actually took over the area where these graves were, and that's why there's bodies in the marsh, at least from the Battle of Dagorlad. So that's how it came to be known as a place of the dead. Now, in Gondor's war against the Wainriders, both Gondor and the Wainriders used the Dead Marshes as sort of a strategic point. They were both trying to drive the other into the marshes, so there are dead Wainriders in there, and there's dead Dunedain in there, and there's dead elves in there. So there's a lot of bodies in the Dead Marsh, partly because the marshes had grown and overtaken a mass grave, and partly because during another war, men and elves were driven, well, not elves in that case, but men were driven into the muck. So when Frodo and Samwise and Gollum travel through the Dead Marshes, Sam and Frodo do see dead faces in the water, and they see dancing lights. It does sort of suggest that the marshes are haunted in some way. But Gollum suggested that it's not real, that the dead faces that they're seeing are not real, because he tried to eat one of the corpses and found that there was nothing actually there. They're likely not. It's not likely haunted in that very strictest sense, because the souls of men and elves would not linger in such a place. They would pass to Mandos, and the men would pass further then beyond Arda. So, if there was any sort of magic involved, it would probably be some necromancy that may have kept some of the souls there. But I think it's really just a place of the dead, and there's swamp gases and such that appear as dancing lights, and it's just a scary place, and it has a reputation of being haunted, and it may be, but I tend to think otherwise. Okay. Next question, this one's anonymous. Did Aragorn do anything when he saw Boromir being attacked by orcs? So this is sort of going by the film, the Peter Jackson film, because Aragorn in the book did not actually see Boromir being attacked by orcs. When Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas followed the sounds of Boromir's horn, they arrived too late to see any fighting. Most of the orcs were killed, and the remaining had fled, and they had captives. They had Merry and Pippin with them, and Boromir was lying there mortally wounded. Boromir had just enough time to tell Aragorn that the orcs had attacked and captured the halflings. He didn't specify which halflings, but Aragorn figured out that it was Merry and Pippin pretty quickly, just based on deduction of the scene there. And shortly before he passed, Boromir also asked Aragorn to save his people. So that's really all that happened. The movie sort of invented this thing where Aragorn comes in while they're still fighting and saves Boromir, but then Boromir still dies. You know, it just made it more dramatic. Okay, next question, also anonymous. How did Mithril end up forming in Moria? Could Durin's Bane have been responsible for Mithril being found there by some effect of his physical being or some sort of passive magic that caused the rare metal to form how it did? So, Mithril is a naturally occurring metal. It's not caused by a Balrog. In the TV show, in Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, they gave sort of a fanciful interpretation of the origins of Mithril, which involved a Balrog, a lightning strike, a Silmaril. It's interesting from a fan fiction standpoint. I thought it was very interesting, but it's not possible in the literary Tolkien verse, in the context of the books. You have to know that Rings of Power and all of the adaptations really exist separately from the Legendarium. They're based on the Legendarium to varying extents, but they are not part of it. So it's not possible in the context of the books because Mithril was not actually exclusive to Moria. It was said to be the only place in Middle-earth that Mithril could be found, but it was also found in Numenor, and we have reason to believe that it was also found in Aemon. Tar Telemanale of Numenor was especially enamored of true silver, as they called it, and he sought it out in his lands. Bilbo also mentioned that in his poem that Earendil's ship, the Vingalot, was reinforced with mithril and elvish glass. So that must have happened in Aemon, because Numenor didn't even exist at the time, and he had sailed west. So the mithril must have come from Aemon. And, when they made the ship fly, its origin in Middle-earth was of simple lumber, but when it came back during the War of Wrath, it was flying, and it was described as having elvish glass and mithril. So with this knowledge, the fact that mithril had only been found under the Misty Mountains and the Balrog also slumbering there under the Misty Mountains is really an unrelated coincidence. The Balrog, there were no Balrogs in Numenor, and there were certainly no Balrogs in Aemon. Okay, next question. This one is from Free Lenu. Once again, I hope I am saying the names right. If you hear your name and I say it incorrectly, you can always feel free to tell me the correct way to say it. Out of all the fathers of the dwarves, why was Durin so renowned? What made him more special than the others that were created with him? So, to be honest, we don't really know that Durin was so different from the other fathers of the dwarves. He was special compared to most dwarves, but we don't know the names of any of the other fathers of the dwarves. We don't know what their deeds were. They may have been of equal importance, but to those specific cultures. We know that Durin the Deathless was called the Deathless because he lived an unnaturally long time for a dwarf, nearly 10 times the average lifespan. And then he reincarnated into his own line 6 times, ending with Durin the Seventh, the last. We do not know the names or the deeds of the other fathers of the dwarves. There were 6 others, but we do know that they were important in some way for being the fathers of the dwarves, but maybe they also lived for a very long time, and they had similar epithets in their own cultures. One thing that we can say, though, is that there are 2 reasons that Durin is different in some way. The first reason is literary, and it's simply because out of the 7 houses of the dwarves, the ones that concern Tolkien's stories, particularly The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, were the Longbeards, also known as Durin's folk. Other dwarven houses and the houseless petty dwarves do occasionally come into play in the Silmarillion and some other stories, but Durin's folk were said to be the friendliest dwarves, which means that they dealt with the other races the most, particularly the elves who were telling the tale of the Silmarillion. So the other reason that Durin is important and different from the other fathers is in the book The Peoples of Middle-earth, we learn that he is the eldest, which could mean a few different things. It likely meant that Aule created him first, making him sort of the prototypical dwarf, the first dwarf. Or possibly Iluvatar had thoughts in his mind for certain fraternal bonds between the Valar, such as Manwë and Melkor being brothers, so perhaps Aule sort of, taking on the Iluvatar role for the dwarves, had this thought, well, this one's the oldest. But I think the first thought is more likely, that he was just created first. It is also said that Durin lay alone. In a letter, Tolkien clarified that the mates were made for the dwarves, but not Durin. So his wife must have come later from the lines of the other dwarves. I'm going to read you an excerpt of one of Tolkien's letters. He said, "This is the elvish legend of the making of the dwarves, but the elves report that Iluvatar said thus also. Nonetheless, I will not suffer my design to be forestalled. Thy children shall not awaken before mine own. And he commanded Aule to lay the fathers of the dwarves severally in deep places, each with his mate, save Durin the eldest, who had none. There they should sleep long until Iluvatar bade them awake. Nonetheless, there had been, for the most part, little love between the dwarves and the children of Iluvatar, and of the fate that Iluvatar has set upon the children of Aule beyond the circles of the world, elves and men know nothing, and if dwarves know, they do not speak of it." So Durin laying alone was thought to initially refer to this, the fact that he had no wife initially, no mate, which was referenced in the book The War of the Jewels. However, the later writings that showed up in the book The Peoples of Middle-earth stated that it also meant that he dwelled separately from the other fathers of the dwarves, and that he awoke alone. They were in other parts of Middle-earth. Okay, good question, though. Okay, so here's a question from an anonymous person. This one doesn't have a name on it. Who is Glorfindel, and what did he do? So Glorfindel was an elf of nobility who lived in Gondolin. He was not greatly important in the overall scheme of Tolkien's story, but he was interesting, and he intersected with a few major stories. Glorfindel was an Oldoran elf. He was of the house of Turgon, who came to Middle-earth as an exile. He did not wish to leave Aemon, but he was loyal to Turgon, and he followed him along the host of Fingolfin across the Helcaraxe, and he did not take part in the kinslaying of the Teleri. So Turgon founded his kingdom, Gondolin, and in it were 12 noble houses. Glorfindel was named the head, or as they say, the chief of the House of the Golden Flower. So he was an important figure in Gondolin. Along with Turgon, he joined the Union of Mathros, and he fought in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, and along with Ecthelion, he protected the refugees as they retreated. After Gondolin's fall and the death of Turgon and Ecthelion, Glorfindel led the survivors away from the city, but they were attacked by a Balrog. Glorfindel fought the Balrog, leaping close to it in a grapple, and he stabbed the Balrog in the abdomen with his dagger, killing it. But as the Balrog fell into the ravine that they were fighting next to, it grabbed Glorfindel by the hair and dragged him down with it, killing him. His body was retrieved by the eagles and buried at Cirith Thoranath. So Glorfindel's spirit would have returned to Aemon at this time, and after a short time in Mandos, he was re-embodied. His grave in Middle-earth remained undisturbed until Beleriand sank into the sea. Glorfindel remained in Aemon until the Second Age. It was said that Glorfindel was already a very mighty elf, but that his reincarnation made him mightier still, as he had died in a self-sacrificial manner. He was saving others. So during his time in Aemon, he also became a student of Olorin. We know him as Gandalf. So Glorfindel was sent to Middle-earth in the Second Age on a mission from Manwë, possibly at the same time as the Blue Wizards, Alatar and Palando. We don't know if he traveled with them, though. His mission was specifically to assist the Noldor High King, Arenian Gil-galad, and Lord Elrond of Imladris in the struggle against Morgoth's servant, Sauron. Due to the great power that Glorfindel had, he tended to veil his power and work behind the scenes. So there's not a lot of history written about him in the Second Age. In the Third Age, of course, Glorfindel took part in the Battle of Fornost against the Witch King, and he made the prophecy that the Witch King's doom lay far off and it would not be by the hand of man. Glorfindel met Aragorn out in the field in Book 1 of The Lord of the Rings and assisted him in bringing the wounded Frodo to Imladris, giving Frodo his horse. The Nazgul were caught between Frodo and Glorfindel drove them into the Ford of Bruin and into the river, which was flooded by Elrond, with a little help from Gandalf. Glorfindel took part in the Council of Elrond, and after this, we don't know anything about him. We don't know if he fought in the War of the Ring in any capacity, if he sailed west, or what happened to him after the Council of Elrond. He's just not mentioned. Okay, next question. This is an easy one. When the Nazgul lost the horse... This is anonymous, by the way. When the Nazgul lost the horses in the river, how did they get back to Mordor? That would have been an odd Uber ride. Yeah, a strange Uber ride indeed. But Tolkien did, in fact, explain how they got back. It was in the story The Hunt for the Ring, which you can find in Unfinished Tales. The council in Imladris, in the last homely house in Rivendell, believed that all of the horses had been killed. But we learn in Unfinished Tales that that's not true, that there was one horse that did survive. And the Witch King took that horse back to Mordor, where he was afforded extra demonic power by Sauron, who also... sent out forces to assist the remaining Nazgul in returning to Mordor. So in a way, they did call for a ride. It just took several months for the ride to get there. So I like the idea of that. Middle-earth Uber. It's a very interesting concept. It takes months to get there. Okay, next question. This one is from Billy Godlucky? I hope I'm saying that right. Is Morgoth the true main villain of the entire Middle-earth, even during the events of The Lord of the Rings? Is he behind everything? So yes, Morgoth is indeed behind everything. That doesn't mean that he is the focal villain of every story, though. Morgoth is the source of all evil. Everything evil comes from him. From the grand evil of Sauron to the petty evil of the corrupt master of Esgaroth. Morgoth did this by tainting the creation of the world and the universe itself. In Tolkien's universe, he has a creation myth called Ainulindale. Morgoth, which was then going by his true name, which is Melkor, he sang themes, because it was song that created the universe and the world. He sang themes that were discordant to those of Iluvatar being God. And Iluvatar told him, in no uncertain terms, no one may alter the music in my despite. Nothing that Melkor could do could mar the beauty of his creation. And it would only lead to greater and more beautiful things that Melkor could not even conceive in his mind. So in other words, even though he was acting against God, at least in thought, he could not actually defy God's will. So the existence of orcs, trolls, dragons, the corruption of the Ainur that gave us villains such as Sauron and the Balrogs, that's all Melkor's doing. He is the answer to questions like, why do bad things happen to good people. Why does evil exist? It's because of Melkor. So he is indeed the greater scope villain of all of Tolkien's works in the Legendarium. This does not mean that he is the focus of every individual story. Let's use The Hobbit as an example, where the main antagonist is Smaug, and also the greater concept of greed. One could say that Smaug is a descendant of the first dragons that were created by Morgoth, and that greed exists because of Melkor's discordant themes. This is 100% true. But what is also true is that Tolkien didn't have any of that in mind when he wrote The Hobbit. It was a fairy story about a hobbit and the dragon and some dwarves. It didn't have a connection to his greater legendarium at its point of conception. Similarly, before being connected to his greater creation, the Legendarium, The Lord of the Rings was a standalone sequel to The Hobbit, with a necromancer that was previously mentioned in The Hobbit becoming the sequel villain. And he had initially no connection to Sauron from the Silmarillion, who had evolved from a character that was Melkor's cat named Tevildo. There was an in-between where he was called Thu, the necromancer Thu, and that became Gurthur, which is an alternate name for Sauron. So saying that Morgoth is the central villain of The Lord of the Rings, technically correct, but it's sort of like saying that Satan is the central villain of every story. Okay, next question. This one is from Elizabeth McDougall. I always enjoy Elizabeth's questions. Were the elves of Doriath considered Eldar, since Thingol had seen the light of Aemon and Melian was an actual goddess? So I could semantically argue that all the elves are Eldar. But the distinction is, of course, understood. My only issue with the question is Melian's not a goddess. Let's address that first. So, Tolkien saw the Ainur as angels, not gods. He didn't mention in this Silmarillion that what the elves called the 15 greatest of the Ainur, which had descended into Arda, was Valar, which means powers. But a note says it is Englished as gods, with a lowercase g, suggesting that while the European interpretation of Valar may be akin to a pantheon of gods, he did not see them as gods with a capital G, but as a Catholic application, we may assume that the Valar were more akin to archangels. In either case, Melian is not one of the Valar, she's a Maiar, so she's of a lesser order of angel than, say, Varda is. The question of the Eldar and its definition is an interesting one, because the literal translation of Eldar is people of the stars. More poetically, people under the starlight might be appropriate, but the translation of Eldar that is the most applicable is elves. They called themselves initially the Quendi, which means speakers, because they were the first beings to speak with voices, at least as far as they knew, because they didn't know about the Valar or the Maiar or Iluvatar. They just looked around. There's animals, there's trees and such, and we're the only ones making mouth noises and creating languages, so they call themselves Quendi, which in their language means speaker. So the later usage of Eldar, well, first let me get to the initial usage. So when Orome, the huntsman of the Valar, came across the elves for the first time, he called them Eldar. So that was his word for the elves. The later usage came from one of the many sunderings of the elves, and the Eldar referred to those that began the Great Journey, with those that did not start the Great Journey becoming known as the Avari, which means unwilling. So I'm going to read the relevant part of the Silmarillion here. In the beginning, the elder children of Iluvatar were stronger, and keep in mind, I just want to point that there's a difference between elder and Eldar. I'm trying to be very careful in enunciating. In the beginning, the elder children of Iluvatar were stronger and greater than they have since become. The word been wasn't in there. I'm sorry, I'm messed up today. I'm very tired. But not more fair, for though the beauty of the Quendi in the days of their youth was beyond all other beauty that Iluvatar has cause to be, it has not perished, but lives in the west, and sorrow and wisdom have enriched it. And Orome loved the Quendi, and named them in their own tongue Eldar, the people of the stars. But that name was after borne only by those who followed him upon the westward road. So the applications are interesting. Tolkien did not state that only the elves that made it to Aemon and saw the light of the two trees of Valinor were the Eldar. It was those who started the journey, who followed Orome, which would include all of the elves that were not Avari, including Thingol and his people, all the Sindar elves, and the Sylvan elves as well. So, however, it mentions that those who started the journey, not those who came after or were born in Aemon or were born of the Noldor that came to Middle-earth. So it seems that there's no connection to the trees. At least there was no connection intended. But the term, which ostensibly means elves, came to mean this specific group of elves that came out of Cuiviénen for the purposes of starting a journey to Aemon, whether or not they made it there. For this purpose, the term Eldar can be either extremely specific or extremely broad. It either means this specific group of elves and no others, or it means all elves ever. So I do question, though, why did the elves decide that the word that Orome called them was only appropriate to those that left Cuiviénen? Was it because the earliest orcs may have been the Avari? Which is a possibility. And maybe the elves didn't want to paint themselves with the same brush as those that became orcs. And I'm not saying that every Avari could have become orcs, because there were Avari that walked alongside men and taught them. But it is true that there were many who did not start the journey because they were captured by Melkor. Or, and this is my more preferred sort of theory here, Bilbo, who had translated the Silmarillion from Old Elvish lore, maybe he was confused a little bit about the word Eldar and its applications, and he came up with an alternate explanation as to why the word isn't really used anymore. I think that's more likely. Bilbo and Frodo have sort of very different approaches to the Elvish tongue. In The Lord of the Rings, which is largely written in universe by Frodo and Samwise, Elrond is called an Eldar. Glorfindel is called the Eldar. They're called the Lords of the Eldar that live in Imladris. They mention wars of the Eldar and the Edain from Thangorodrim. Feanor is called the greatest Eldar, despite the fact that he was born after the Great Journey. Appendix A even refers to Luthien, Idril, and Arwen as Eldar. So it's clear that Frodo's understanding of the word Eldar means elves. Well, Bilbo did not come across that word very often, or maybe he misunderstood it and he came up with an explanation as to why it fell out of usage in latter days. Okay, excellent question. Okay, this next one is a quick one. This is very easy to answer, and it's an anonymous one. Are Elrond and Elros twins? If they're not, which one is older? So they are twins. The information is sort of buried deep in the history of Middle-earth. The Silmarillion only mentions that they were brothers. Earendil took Elwing as his wife, and she bore him 2 sons. Very simple stuff. And it was not mentioned when they were born or in what order they were born, but the book The War of the Jewels clears it up, and it mentions the birth date for both of them as 532 of the First Age, and clarifies that they were in fact twins. The exact wording was 532, Elrond and Elros, twin sons of Earendil born. No mention of which was born first. So if one of them is about 5 or 10 minutes older than the other, we don't know about that. Okay, so this is a big one to get through. This is from Alice Stone. Alice asked me, how did J.R.R. and Edith Tolkien complement each other as a couple, and how did their shared love shape his work? So, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think there would be a legendarium at all if not for Edith Tolkien. She gave up her religion and therefore her good relations with her family to marry the professor. Edith inspired the character of Luthien, originally conceived as a fairy who sacrificed much to be with her lover, the elf Beren. But as their relationship matured and Tolkien kept rewriting the story, Luthien became the elf who gave up immortality to be with Beren, who was a man. Aside from Beren and Luthien, which Tolkien called his most important work, was the story by which the template for Aragorn and Arwen would be laid. Their marriage, of course, produced the most important people that were involved in the Legendarium, other than Tolkien himself, his kids. The Hobbit was a bedtime story for Christopher. Tom Bombadil was inspired by a doll that John Tolkien tried to flush down the toilet. And much of the artwork from The Hobbit, the illustrations, were repurposed and remade from a story written for Michael. So it is, of course, easy and common to point out that Tolkien and his wife have a shared grave, and the epitaphs are Beren and Luthien. But less commonly seen is the reasoning behind it. So I'm going to read you a bit of Letter 340, which was written to Tolkien's son Christopher shortly after Edith's death. I have at last got busy about Mummy's grave. The inscription I should like is Edith Mary Tolkien, 1889 to 1971, Luthien. Brief and genuine, except for Luthien, which says for me more than a multitude of words, for she was, and knew she was, my Luthien. Say what you feel without reservation about this edition. I begin this under the stress of great emotion and regret, and in any case I am afflicted from time to time increasingly with an overwhelming sense of bereavement. I need advice, yet I hope none of my children will feel the use of this name is a sentimental fancy. It is at any rate not comparable to the quoting of pet names and obituaries. I never called Edith Luthien, but she was the source of the story that in time became the chief pan of the Silmarillion. It was first conceived in a small woodland glade filled with hemlocks at Roos in Yorkshire, where I was for a brief time in command of an outpost of the Humber garrison in 1917, and she was able to live with me for a while. In those days her hair was raven, her skin clear, her eyes brighter than you have seen them, and she could sing and dance. But the story has gone crooked, and I am left, and I cannot plead before the inexorable Mandos. So the first draft, so to speak, of Beren and Luthien, the earliest bit was a poem written by Tolkien in a hospital during the First World War, and much of his hospital writings would become Beren and Luthien and the Fall of Gondolin, at least the primitive versions of them. They were married in 1916, but they had been in love since 1909 when they met. And the poem was inspired by his love and the glade that was mentioned in that excerpt. And it was the basis of most of his later work, as the Lay of Leithian was built about it. I'm going to read you the original poem. The leaves were long, the grass was green, the hemlock umbels tall and fair, and in the glade a light was seen, of stars in shadow shimmering. Tinuviel was dancing there, to music of a pipe unseen, and light of stars was in her hair, and in her raiment glimmering. There Beren came from mountains cold, and lost he wandered under leaves, and where elven river rolled, he walked alone and sorrowing. He peered between the hemlock leaves, and saw in wonder flowers of gold, upon her mantle and her sleeves, and her hair like shadow following. Enchantment healed his weary feet, that over hills were doomed to roam, and forth he hastened strong and fleet, and grasped at moonbeams glistening. Through woven woods and elven home, she lightly fled on dancing feet, and left him lonely still to roam in silent forests listening. He heard thereof the flying sound of feet as light as linden leaves, or music welling underground in hidden hollows quavering. Now withered lay the hemlock sheaves, and one by one in sighing sound, whispering fell the beechen leaves in the wintry woodland wavering. He sought her after, wandering far, where leaves of years were thickly strewn, by light of moon and ray of star, and frosty heavens shivering. Her mantle glinted at the moon, as on a hilltop high and far. She danced, and at her feet was strewn a mist of silver quivering. When winter passed, she came again, and her song released the sudden spring, like rising lark and falling rain, and melting water bubbling. He saw the elven flowers spring about her feet and healed again. He longed by her to dance and sing upon the grass untroubling. Again she fled, but swift he came. Tinuviel, Tinuviel, he called her by her elvish name. And there she halted listening. One moment stood she in a spell. His voice laid on her Beren came, and doom fell on Tinuviel, that in his arms lay glistening. As Beren looked into her eyes, within the shadows of her hair, the trembling starlight of the skies, he saw there mirrored shimmering. Tinuviel, the elven fair, immortal maiden elven wise, about him cast her shadowy hair, and arms like silver glimmering. Long was the way that fate then bore, o'er stormy mountains cold and grey, through halls of iron and darkling door, and woods of nightshade morrowless. The sundering seas between them lay, and yet at last they met once more, and long ago they passed away, in the forest singing sorrowless. So finally, for my final excerpt that I'm going to use as an example here of the importance of Tolkien's relationship with his wife, I will submit his feelings about love, written in letter 43, which was to his son Michael, who was considering marrying a nurse that he had met while in the hospital during World War II. Tolkien, for the greater part of the letter, waxes poetic about the difference between sexual attraction, platonic love, intimate feelings, and true love. But of course, at the end of the rambling, he comes back to Edith, and I'm going to read you the very final part of that letter. Think of your mother, yet I do not know for a moment... I screwed that up, sorry. Think of your mother, yet I do not now for a moment feel that she was doing more than she should have been asked to do. Not that that detracts from the credit of it. I was a young fellow with a moderate degree, and apt to write verse, a few dwindling pounds, and no prospects, a second lieutenant on July 6th, a day in the infantry where the chances of survival were against you heavily, as a subaltern. She married me in 1916, and John was born in 1917, conceived and carried during the starvation year of 1917 and the great U-boat campaign. Round about the Battle of Cambrai, when the end of the war seemed as far off as it does now. I sold out and spent to pay the nursing home the last of my few South African shares, my patrimony. Out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your loves upon earth, and more than that, death, by the divine paradox that which ends life and demands the surrender of all, and yet by the taste or foretaste of which alone can what you seek in your earthly relationships, love, faithfulness, joy, be maintained, or take on that complexity of reality, of eternal endurance, which every man's heart desires. So, it is possible that no man has ever loved a woman as much as he loved his wife. I'm being facetious, of course, but there would be no, if not for the relationship, there would be none of his stories. None of them. I don't think a single one of them would exist as they do now. They would, and if they did, it would have been in an extremely stunted form. Okay. Next question. This one is from Samuel Kent, who asks, in The Lord of the Rings, the One Ring cannot be destroyed, aside from the cracks of Mount Doom. Could the Free Peoples have instead made an effort to find and destroy the other rings, so the one could have nothing to control? So I think it's an interesting theory, as if all of the rings of power were gone, there were no rings to bind to the one. However, the plan would not have worked. Sadly, it would not have worked that way. For one, out of the 19 rings of power, Sauron himself held 12 of them. The 9 rings that he confiscated from the Nazgul after they had been permanently bound to him, and 3 out of the 7 rings originally given to the dwarves, with the other 4 being destroyed by dragons. This would only lead the 3, and the destruction of the 3 would severely weaken the realms of Imladris and Lothlorien as well as Gandalf. The other issue here is that the One Ring is useful to Sauron even besides controlling the other rings. If he regained it, even if there were no more rings to rule, he would be able to make more. And failing that, he had no issue using the One Ring's power of domination in Numenor, and he did have the ring in Numenor. Some people say he did not, but he did in fact have the ring in Numenor. And another thing, just to tack on here as well, he didn't need the ring. If all those other rings were destroyed, and really it's just 3 of them, what have we accomplished? We've made Lorien weaker, we've made Rivendell weaker, we've made Gandalf weaker, but we have not made Sauron weaker, because he doesn't actually have the ring. And he doesn't need the ring. The ring was not the key to his victory. The ring was only the key to his destruction. Okay, next question. This is another anonymous one, a very quick one. How many rings did the elves make? So they made a lot of rings, but there were 19 of them that were the chief rings. There were 19 rings of power that were created by the elves. 16 were made under the supervision of Annatar, who was actually Sauron, and 3 more were made by Celebrimbor after Annatar had left Eregion. There were, of course, also an uncounted number of lesser rings, which Gandalf described as practice attempts with no powerful magic. They were just trinkets. Tolkien did not write much about the lesser rings, pretty much just what Gandalf said, and he did not specify whether or not they were bound to the one. Okay, here's another easy question, another anonymous one. If Gandalf and Boromir would not have died, how was the plan to enter Mordor, since I don't believe Gandalf would have gone to Rohan or Gondor? Gandalf did not elucidate his plan on how to enter Mordor specifically, though it was likely that the Fellowship would have split anyway. No one knew what Gandalf's plan was beyond traveling to Lothlorien, and it's possible, at least according to Aragorn, that he did not have a plan beyond that point, that he would have been putting his wisdom together with Galadriel's and Celeborn's, and perhaps use the Mirror of Galadriel to see how to proceed. That being said, it is possible that Gandalf may have had knowledge of a way into Mordor from the north, like a mountain pass. The Fellowship would still split up, however. Boromir had no plans to go to Mordor, and it was likely that Aragorn would go to Gondor with him. Okay, next question. This one's also anonymous, and also another very easy one to answer. In The Lord of the Rings, why don't the Nazgul wear armor instead of cloaks or something similar? Armor is no use to them. Nazgul are invisible, or at least they exist entirely in the Wraith world, and they cannot be seen normally by most people. They wear the cloaks to give themselves shape, which helps them in communicating with living folk. It was mentioned, though, that the Nazgul's main power, their aura of fear that emanates from them, works best when they are unclad. The cloaks actually dull their power. So cloaks can be easily cast off very quickly. Armor, you have to sort of meticulously take it off. It cannot be taken off very quickly. And it doesn't really offer any sort of protection for them anyway, so there would be no reason for them to wear armor. Okay, next question. Why doesn't Saruman flee to Mordor after his defeat at Isengard? Directly following the sack of Isengard, he was afraid. He was too afraid to move, and after that he was trapped for a while. So Saruman feared the Ents. He called them demons. He would not step out of his tower until he came to the balcony to parley with Gandalf. Now, at this point, he was offered pardon in exchange for his staff and the keys to Orthanc, a deal that he rejected. And so he was remanded to stay in Orthanc by order of the White. Saruman did manage to eventually talk his way out of Orthanc by feigning repentance to Treebeard, and Treebeard really didn't feel that he was a jailer, so he was like, oh, he's been locked up long enough, we'll let him out there. But let's talk about Gandalf's terms. He asked for the key and the staff for pardon, but did state that Saruman could go anywhere he wanted to go, even to Mordor if he wished, though Gandalf pointed out it would be a very bad idea. I'm going to read you that relevant excerpt from The Two Towers. Reasons for leaving you can see from your windows, answered Gandalf. Others will occur to your thoughts. Your servants are destroyed and scattered. Your neighbors you have made your enemies, and you have cheated your new master, or tried to do so. When his eye turns thither, it will be the red eye of wrath. But when I say free, I mean free. Free from bond or chain or command, to go where you will, even to Mordor, Saruman, if you desire. But you will first surrender to me the key of Orthanc and your staff. They shall be pledges of your conduct, to be returned later, if you merit them. So Saruman tried to cheat Sauron, and everybody knew it, including Sauron. Sauron saw through him the very first time they communicated. So he would have no reason to go to Mordor. It would be very bad if he did that. Bad for him, at least. Okay. Next question. This is another anonymous one. Why is the light of Earendil the elves' most beloved star? So there's two main reasons that the Star of Earendil would be beloved over even the sun and the moon. The first reason is what the light represents. The Silmaril in the sky, which is what the Star of Earendil actually is the only way for the elves to see the captured light of Lorelin, the Golden Telperi, and the Silver, the two trees of Valinor. They're gone, but their light remains in the Silmaril, and while it's while its mates lie deep underwater and deep under the earth, Earendil's star is up there and anybody could look up and see it. The second reason that the light is not just merely light from a Silmaril, but it's on the Vingalot, a Mithril ship sailed through the sky by Earendil himself. We talked about this earlier when we talked about Mithril. Earendil was a great hero of the First Age, the one who convinced Manwë to send a host to Beleriand, kickstarting the War of Wrath, which led to Morgoth's defeat. Earendil in his ship also slew Ancalagan, turning the tide of the war in the favor of the host of the Valar. Earendil is also the father of Lord Elrond of Imladris and Tar Miniatar, also known as Elros, the first king of Numenor. So he's an amazingly important guy, is what I'm saying. His pedigree is incredible from a historical standpoint, from a cultural standpoint. He's important to Middle-earth, he's important to Aemon, and anybody can simply look up at the sky and know that he's out there. Okay, final question. And we got this in under an hour, so that's always nice when I get it in under an hour. Although I have a lot to say about this last one, but I don't think it's going to be 10 minutes long. It's another anonymous question, but it's a good one. How is it that Frodo and Sam were able to carry the ring, but Boromir couldn't even handle being tempted by it? So it's true that hobbits are just sort of naturally tough, but the difference here is intent. Frodo and Sam both carried the ring during the quest, chiefly Frodo, but Sam carried it as well. And their goal, their wish, well, Frodo's wish was to bring it to Samath Naur and cast it into the fire, and Sam's was to help Frodo, or to do it if Frodo could not. Frodo was overcome at the end, and he claimed the ring as his own. It had become precious to him. But of course, we can forgive him for that. He had already done a great heroic deed. He got the ring to Samath Naur. That was nearly impossible to do, and he did it. Now, the ring there at Samath Naur was at the zenith of its power and its corruption and its seduction. Sam, for his part, gave up the ring willingly. Despite being shown visions of himself as a great hero who could turn Middle-earth into a vast garden, Sam was able to resist this simply because he didn't want to be a hero. He didn't want to be Samwise the Brave. He wanted to be Samwise the Gardener. All he ever wanted was a place of his own in a little garden that he could tend to, and to fulfill his duty and to go home. Now, on the contrary, Boromir never wanted to destroy the ring. He saw it as a weapon, and as a weapon could be used by Sauron, he reasoned it could also be used against Sauron, even after being told multiple times that no one but Sauron could truly wield the ring. And even if they could wield the ring, they could only do evil with it. He did not seem to really believe it, and still he thought it would be wiser to, if not use the ring, to hide it away from Sauron rather than bring it into his domain to destroy. Before it was made clear that Samath Naur was the only place that one could destroy the One Ring, Boromir was not happy with the thought of it being destroyed. I'm going to read you an excerpt from The Fellowship of the Ring. "Alas no," said Elrond. "We cannot use the ruling ring. That we know too well. It belongs to Sauron and was made by him alone, and is altogether evil. Its strength, Boromir, is too great for anyone to wield at all, save only for those who have already a great power of their own. But for them it holds an even deadlier peril. The very desire of it corrupts the heart. Consider Saruman. If any of the wise should with this ring overthrow the Lord of Mordor, using his own arts, he would then set himself on Sauron's throne, and yet another Dark Lord would appear. And that is another reason why the ring should be destroyed. As long as it is in the world, it will be a danger even to the wise, for nothing is evil in the beginning. Even Sauron was not so. I fear to take the ring to hide it. I will not take the ring to wield it." "Nor I," said Gandalf. Boromir looked at them doubtfully, but he bowed his head. "So be it," he said. "Then in Gondor we must trust to such weapons as we have. And at the least, while the wise ones guarded the ring, we will fight on. Mayhap the sword that was broken may still stem the tide, if the hand that wields it has inherited not an heirloom only, but the sinews of the kings of man." So in this passage, both Elrond and Gandalf tell Boromir that they will not use the ring, and that only those with great power could, but that if those who had great power did, they would become corrupted, like Sauron. Boromir goes along with it, but he looks at them doubtfully. Now later on, when Boromir demands the ring from Frodo, he goes on quite the rant about what he may accomplish with it. And I'm going to read you that passage from later in The Fellowship of the Ring. Boromir got up and walked about impatiently. "So you go on," he cried. "Gandalf, Elrond, all these folk have taught you to say so, for they themselves they may be right. These elves and half-elves and wizards. They would come to grief, perhaps, yet often I doubt if they are wise and not merely timid. But each to his own kind, true-hearted men, they will not be corrupted. We of Minas Tirith have been staunch through long years of trial. We do not desire the power of wizard lords, only strength to defend ourselves, strength in a just cause, and behold, in our need chance brings to light the Ring of Power. It is a gift, I say. A gift to the foes of Mordor. It is mad not to use it, to use the power of the enemy against him. The fearless, the ruthless, these alone will achieve victory. What could not a warrior do in this hour, a great leader? What could not Aragorn do? Or if he refuses, why not Boromir? The ring would give me power to command. How I would drive the hosts of Mordor, and all men would flock to my banner." Boromir strode up and down, speaking ever more loudly. Almost he seemed to have forgotten Frodo. While his talk dwelt on walls and weapons and the mustering of men, he drew plans for great alliances and glorious victories to be, and he cast down Mordor, and he became himself a mighty king, benevolent and wise. Suddenly he stopped and waved his arms. "And they tell us to throw it away," he cried. "I do not say destroy it. That might be well if reason could show any hope of doing so. It does not. The only plan that is proposed to us is that a halfling should walk blindly into Mordor and offer the enemy every chance of recapturing it for himself. Folly." "Surely you see it, my friend," he said, turning now suddenly to Frodo again. "You say that you are afraid. If it is so, the boldest should pardon you. But is it not really your good sense that revolts?" "No, I am afraid," said Frodo. "Simply afraid. But I am glad to have heard you speak so fully. My mind is clearer now." The One Ring could have chosen anybody nearby to tempt, but it chose Boromir because he was the only person in the Fellowship who really didn't want to destroy the ring. He believed it was the hope of Gondor, and before you know it, he sees himself as the great hero who can cast out Sauron and become a king himself. Boromir was the weak link spiritually. His conviction was noble, but he was willing to take up foul means, the One Ring, to do fair works, which is a theme that Tolkien visits upon many times, that it is impossible to do evil things to accomplish good results. And we got finished in under an hour, and if you made your way all the way to the end of the video, you must have liked it. You can hit that like button, it helps me out. I won't be buried under everything else in the algorithm. If you haven't subscribed, hit that subscription, hit the bell, all that stuff. Leave me some comments. I'll see you guys next week.